Hello, and welcome to another episode of Leaders of Transformation. Today, we're going to talk with Sarah Symons. She started her Future Coalition in 2005 with her husband. And since 2005, they have been creating powerful and positive change in the lives of survivors of gender violence and girls at their highest risk. They break the cycle of poverty and exploitation by providing education and a full range of services that support that education to survivors and the most vulnerable girls in India and Nepal. She is very passionate about empowering survivors to be change makers in their own families and communities. So they're not just surviving, they're thriving. And she is the author of two books, one which is called This Is No Ordinary Joy, and the second one, which she co-authored with one of the survivors that they've worked with, and it's called Standing in the Way. Sarah, welcome to the Leaders Transformation. We're excited that you're here today.
Thanks for having me.
It's so good to have you here, and I'm so grateful for what you're doing. And your story inspired me as I started to explore it. Actually, that's a great opportunity right now to give a shout out to Oscar Hamilton. James from Oscar Hamilton connected us. I love all the support that we get with this podcast. People that hear about somebody that's doing something amazing in the world and they're saying, hey, you know what, you've got to have this person on, we got to showcase them. And so that's what happened in this case. And so we appreciate Oscar Hamilton and the team there connecting us with Sarah so that we could hear her story and we could feature it here, and so that not only can get her message get out there, but so that it can inspire you, that maybe you're looking at doing something, or you think, what can one person do? How can one person make a difference in the world? And I think through listening to Sarah's story and some of the stories that of her survivors becoming change makers can inspire you to realize that you can actually make a big difference. So with that, Sarah, can you just give us an idea of like, how did you actually get into this or into this space of working with survivors, gender violence, human trafficking, exploitation? Where did it start for you?
Well, it started in a very unplanned and unexpected way. I had a very different kind of life at that time. This was 19, almost 20 years ago. I was living on Cape Cod, working as a songwriter for film and television. My husband was an investment banker, and our children were very small. And I just felt like he had a very full life and really wasn't looking for some life-changing new direction. But then one of my songs was featured in a film that was in Tribeca Film Festival. So I went down to New York to see that. And while there, I saw this incredible documentary, which really transformed my life. And it was called The Day My God Died. And it was telling the stories of young girls who'd been trafficked from Nepal into the brothels of India, and really exposed the terrible suffering of that situation, the injustice that they faced even after they were rescued. But the part that was the most powerful for me was actually the inspiration of seeing all these people from around the world, different walks of life, who were facing this issue down. And rather than being overwhelmed by the enormity of it, or avoiding the horror of it, we're taking action and doing things to help survivors and to prevent girls from being trafficked. And some of the people in the film were themselves survivors who'd been rescued and were putting their lives on the line to save others and to stop others from having to experience what they did. So looking at seeing all these people, seeing these survivors and their courage, it felt like there has got to be something I can do to help. And I made the decision that very day to devote my life to working on this issue and to trying to bring opportunities and a different future to those who had experienced it or those who were imminently about to experience it.
Well, I think about that moment when sometimes we see something that angers us or just grieves us, and it's the feeling like I got to do something, but then there's the follow through of actually taking action and saying I am going to do something about that. And so, you obviously did that. How did you determine what services that you were going to provide? Obviously this is a big issue, there's a lot of different moving parts to it, a lot of resistance to even change in this arena. So how did you make that decision of like where you were specifically going to make a difference?
Mm. Well, I guess my biggest touchstone was to kind of come at this from a place of humility, recognizing that I did not have any expertise on this issue or in international relations or development going into this. So I really needed to rely on the local organizations who were already doing the work, who were embedded in the communities, and who knew best how to approach this. And the other primary value is collaboration. And I think no one organization, no person, no organization, even a very big one, is going to be able to combat trafficking and fight it back on their own. We need all kinds of solutions, ranging from legal solutions to more social work oriented prevention, working with law enforcement, we're doing the rescues, sheltering the girls, educating them. And there's so many different facets to work on. And so everyone needs to work together in order to be successful. And instead of coming, in with a big ego, I'm like, I know how to fix this. You need to come in with an attitude of like, okay, what's working and where can I add to this or be of service to make this work better? So we very much tried to do that. We reached out to local organizations, starting with the ones featured in the film. Two of the organizations featured in the film, and asked them, where they felt we could be most helpful to them. And they asked us to work on economic alternatives and employment solutions for older survivors. So we started there. And by older, I mean girls who were rescued at age 16 or up, probably have almost no primary school education and may not want to go back to kindergarten and rejoin society that way. So they were looking for jobs that someone with low literacy and high trauma and high stigma could do. So we started working on that. But then over the years, we grew, and our understanding of what survivors needed evolved and changed. And so while we definitely still work on the vocational training piece, we've added a lot of education programs, both for survivors and for their children, and for young children who are either growing up in a red light area, or a sister or mother has been trafficked and otherwise have been identified as extremely imminently at risk. And finally, creating shelter and building on the shelters that are there so that there's a safe place for people to go right after they've been rescued.
Got it. Now, just stepping back a moment and talking about how people get trafficked. These girls, I know it's not exclusive to girls. I know also boys can be trafficked as well. But specifically, these girls that you're working with, what is the cause of it?
That's such an important question, because I think we've all seen Hollywood movies like Taken, which present a pretty unrealistic view of how this happens in 99.9% of cases. And in most of the cases, the person that's trafficked is not a wealthy girl from the most privileged circumstances. It's mostly happening to people that already had some vulnerabilities. Poverty is a huge vulnerability for people. The death of a parents that have addiction, being a member of a minority or a tribal group. This is the case in America as well as in India and Nepal, that people from indigenous communities are extremely targeted at a much higher level. And here in America, kids coming out of foster care, kids of color, are trafficked at a much higher rate than white kids from middle class communities. So looking at these root causes, and the other huge one is the low status of women in the community. And this is especially an issue in the areas of India and Nepal where we work, where a girl's birth is not celebrated. It's considered burdensome. And because of the dowry system and just other cultural issues, young girls, the least valuable members of society. So when things fall apart, that's who bears the brunt. But in many, many cases, it's not that parents sell their children. That does happen, but is much less common. More commonly, the parents are tricked in thinking that their daughter is going to maybe work as a maid, but will also be able to, go to school or send money home or have a good life. Or in many cases, girls themselves at a young age go to a big city and they're cut off from their support systems, and then they get trafficked by neighbors or a landlady, something like that. And in some cases, getting into a child marriage creates vulnerabilities for girls. Either they might be trafficked by their husband, who might be a trafficker that just married her to trick her, or, he's not a trafficker, but they again move away from their support systems into a big city, and then she becomes very, very vulnerable.
Yeah, it's when I think of the root causes and how obviously there's helping rescue and there's helping healing. And I keep coming back to also like, how do we prevent this from happening in the first place? Do you do education around that as well in terms of educating what to look for,
Mm.
educating girls, educating parents, or do you know organizations that do that? And then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the girls that you work with. But I think that's important for us to bring into this conversation as well.
Absolutely. And it's so much better to prevent this from happening than to try to heal someone after it has happened, because it's just so devastating obviously on so many levels, physical, psychological, and spiritual in every way. So we do a lot of prevention work, working in villages and educating, both the most vulnerable girls and their parents. And along with that, providing some alternative, making sure girls are in school. They're much, much less likely to be trafficked if they are in school, because the parents can see, okay, there's a hope here, there's a future here. This is someone who could bring something positive into this community and family. So making sure that the most vulnerable girls are in school is a huge part of that. In terms of raising awareness and educating the society as a whole, we are not involved in that, but there are some groups who work on that culture change piece. And I think, again, back to, there are many aspects to this, and it's very important that it be attacked on every single level, locally, internationally, through culture change and through working with individuals and rebuilding lives, which is where our focus remains.
Yeah. Well, I think about like this is leaders of transformation. Transformation is changing the way we see ourselves, others in the world around us, and you're doing all three of those things. And so talk about, I know that we spoke about this briefly beforehand, about the fact that there are some girls that recover and move forward, move on with their lives, and there are others that don't. What makes the difference?
Mm. Mm. I think there are a couple things. I mean, we are very, very fortunate that in the areas where we work and in the shelter homes where we work, the recovery rate is very high. And for the last 15 years, I've been trying to figure out, why is that? Why? And it's really a big focus of my first book. Why are they still having the capacity for joy, for trust? Why, when they're given tools, are they able to use them and move forward? And many are not, in other parts of the world, including sometimes in the United States. What is the factors? And I've thought about it a lot. And while I don't have, a definitive answer, I think one thing is that there is community around them when they're rescued. So they are, according to the laws of India, they usually spend 2 years or 5 or 10 years, depending on their age, in a rescue shelter. And they're surrounded by peers who have experienced the same thing. And so there isn't that sense of isolation. And you can see examples of girls, all around you who are moving forward in their lives despite having experienced the very same trauma or worse. And you see people who are working, who are, moving out of the shelter home, becoming self-sufficient. And that, I think, is an incredible factor. I think it's very, very hard for anyone when they're rescued and then they're sort of off on their own to recover from this. I think that piece of community is immensely important. I think culture too. I think South Asian culture is an incredibly resilient culture. People are used to seeing a lot of suffering around them. It's more out in the open than perhaps in some Western countries. And so, I think it was the Dalai Lama who said, we've removed so much suffering from our society, we're unable to cope with a little bit that remains. And when you haven't removed it, when it's all there out for all to see, actually, there's an advantage to that. And I think there's a sort of sense in India and Nepal of like, I've got to make my life work. There is no safety net. There is no social service system that's going to support me beyond, when I reach 18. So people have to make it work, and they have a culture of resilience of making it work. So there's that. There is still, I'd say, 3 or 4% who are not able to recover and who remain, in their anguish and in their trauma. And it seems to be about, having the ability to see that what happened is not who you are. What happened to you, your abuse, your victimhood is not your identity. And a terrible thing was done to you, but that's not who you are. And if you're continually reliving it, and, it becomes, you're just re-traumatizing yourself every single day. And worse, even what the traffickers or clients did to you, you're doing again in your head, again and again and continually, when the people that are in that situation have a hard time recovering. But even in those really hard cases, there are breakthroughs. And I think it's about putting a really loving, environment of support around a person, having excellent mental health services, and addressing this holistically. You can't just have talk therapy. What has happened, did it come through verbally? The abuse came through your body, specifically, through your reproductive area. And I think there needs to be healing that is more kinesthetic, with dance or even art, ways that people can express that pain beyond just words, because they may not have words for it. May have happened before they knew the words for those things, or the trauma may have kind of shut down that verbal processing. And there has to be a way to kind of talk it through. As you mentioned, I recently wrote a book with one of our survivors, Anjali, and she was trafficked at age 12 from a village in rural Nepal. With many of the vulnerabilities in place. Her father had died, family was very poor, there was some mental illness in her family, and she was trafficked by some uncles. Thankfully, she was rescued after about 17 indescribably awful months in the brothels of Calcutta, and I met her shortly thereafter. And many wonderful people came into her life and helped her to recover. And some of those were the counselors that worked with her in the early years, incredibly innovative in finding ways to help girls to touch on, to kind of access what happened. Many of the girls, like Anjali, were very young when it happened. They didn't want to talk about it. They weren't really able to talk about it. And these counselors were so creative in finding ways to help people to kind of identify what happened and to share it with at least one other person, to kind of just acknowledge this did happen, share it with at least one other person, and then, to find healing and to be able to move on from it. So a lot of the book isn't about the horror that she experienced while she was trafficked. It's about what came after, what made it possible for her to heal. And now she is going back to her village, opening a school, and she is hell-bent on making sure that the next generation has a different opportunity and a different way forward, because in that village, trafficking has become so normalized that 75-80% of girls are either trafficked to India or forced into child marriages to prevent them being trafficked. So she's going to be changing that equation.
Wow. There's so much there in what you just shared. I think about the role models that other girls can have for them. You talked about how they recover, and the role models that if you don't know a different reality, how do you change your reality if that's what it is? And you just talked about the village. If the village just thinks that's the way it is, and 75% of the women or the girls are being trafficked, and that's just a way of life, how do you change something that is so embedded like that? And so again, coming back to this whole idea of transformation, transforming the way you see yourself, others, in the world around you, it's creating something completely new. And that's where, like when you talk about community, having community around and having role models and seeing someone else, it's like, oh, they've done it. Human beings, that's how we learn, right? We learn by watching and seeing and emulating and so forth. So that is so powerful. And it's so encouraging to hear you talk about the way that they're able to move forward. I think there's a lot that we can learn. And especially like over this past year, there's been a lot of trauma, certainly not on the same level, although that is occurring too, of course, in the US here. And, but the trauma of, like you said, we haven't experienced as much of it. We're not used to seeing this. So we experience a little bit, and it feels like a lot, or we experience a lot, and then it's all relative. It's all relative to our own experience, and to the lessons in there of resilience, the lessons of moving forward and not replaying the same thing over and over again is a great lesson for all of us, is to not keep rewinding and replaying. It's one thing to share it. You mentioned something very important I wanted to go back to, is that, yes, you've got to acknowledge that it occurred and share it with at least one other person, but you don't keep repeating it over and over and over again so that you stay in that reality permanently. And I know you talk about, and a lot of us, of course, we've heard post-traumatic stress, we've heard PTSD. There's a lot of people that are experiencing it right now, even just from what's happened throughout COVID, and of course other things, and that may be triggering from many years ago trauma that occurred that isn't, it's now coming back. So there's all of that going on. But you mentioned something called post-traumatic growth. We're talking a little bit about it now, but I want to just be more specific. And what is it? And how does someone begin to practically embrace that?
It is a concept, and I believe it was pioneered by Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was working with soldiers who had PTSD. And obviously there is, and rightly so, a lot of focus on PTSD and how to help people move forward. But for every trauma that occurs in your life, there is a possibility to use it and to find something from it. And certainly would never say everything happens for a reason. I don't believe that, but I believe that you can make a reason, and you can make something beautiful out of the ashes, of something terrible. And like in Anjali's case, I wish she hadn't have been trafficked, but those are the words she has to work with. And she always says, I got to write a new story with the same words, because you can't change what happened. It has happened. So are you going to rent space in your head to keep punishing yourself and re-trafficking yourself and re-raping yourself and just continually just, renting space to that situation, or or choose, as she has done and many, many others, to change that story, to say, okay, that did happen. Those are the words I have to, what new story can we write with those words? And in her case, if that hadn't happened, she wouldn't have been able to, get a college education and make the connections to be able to open a charity and open a school. Those beautiful things did come from this experience, and her wisdom and her compassion also arose very much from what she suffered. And so I think it's about, when you're in your own life, and I am definitely the worst. I'm like, wake up in the middle of the night and just start regretting and reliving stuff like crazy. And now I've really learned to sort of like shake it off, acknowledge you're doing it, stop that thought process. Like, is that the space I want to rent in my head? No. What can I instead think about, or how can I think about that experience or that mistake or that loss or betrayal or failure, whatever it is, differently, such that I'm starting to make it worth it, make something beautiful out of it, grow from it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think about like our pain oftentimes leads to our purpose. It gives us, it like kind of locks the door to what our passion is, because it's something that's so near and dear to our heart. And so we tend to, and I notice that with clients I've worked with that, have gone through something, and that's what drives them to do what they do, because they don't ever want to experience that themselves. They don't want others to experience that. They want to help others who are experiencing that. And so it becomes this fuel to move them forward. And I don't think any of us would celebrate a trauma and say, yay, I'm so glad it happened. And yet, how many times have we seen the blessing that has come out of it by choice? Like you say, you create your meaning out of it. So powerful. I alluded to it briefly about COVID. I know that there has been a dramatic effect on women's issues globally as a result of COVID. Can you speak to that?
It has been very, very hard on the most vulnerable. In Calcutta, where we have a lot of our operations, there was a very strict lockdown. You couldn't leave your house except for the police permission, and only to get food. for 2.5 months. Schools were closed. People did not have Wi-Fi in order to have an online school experience. And schools have remained closed up until now. So a lot of kids lost an entire year of school, which is just critical for girls like ours. And it was, there was a risk of hunger and starvation. We and a lot of other nonprofits kind of switched directions real quick and went more into food feeding and relief work, which is not really what we do or our mission, but it was necessary to keep girls from getting trafficked, because in the early weeks of that lockdown, families didn't even have a can of food or a bag of rice, nothing going into it. There was no warning, and they have no money to have stockpiled food, so there was just nothing. And girls were starting to be sent out to beg, and we know what's coming next. Girls getting trafficked. So we and our partners on the ground, kind of changed directions, did a lot of emergency food relief. We're able to prevent, it from getting any worse, and nobody was trafficked and families were fed. But the other thing was for girls who had been trafficked, which is, a large part of our population, being locked inside was incredibly triggering and re-traumatizing. I mean, triggering is not even the word. It was like, it was a trauma. It was like, here, this is happening again, and I have no control. They have no controls. Very frightening and distressing situation. And some people really, struggled and kind of freaked out, understandably, from that. So we kind of doubled down on the mental health services that we provide. And again, that is going better as well. But, and again, domestic violence for people who have an abusive family member, now you're stuck inside with him all day long, and there's no escape going to school or going, to after school programs. It was really, really hard. It was really, really hard. And I'm very hopeful that, soon the schools will be able to reopen, and some of our centers, like in the red light areas, have reopened at a lower capacity because we just had to. It was just not, those kids live in one room in a brothel with their mother, and when clients come, they need somewhere to be that's not that one room.
It's hard to imagine here in North America. I mean, I know it happens here too, but it's hard to almost even comprehend the life that they have to live and have to endure. And so, yeah, it's just, I remember seeing a movie, film similar to like what you did, and I wasn't expecting it. And it was traumatizing to me just to watch this and go, this is happening. Like, oh my gosh, how can this possibly be happening? And then recently, somebody was telling me about what was happening in the US here. And it's like, this is happening. Like, this is crazy. This should not happen, and it's doing something about it. And so, like you are doing and getting the message out about this, what is the danger of staying silent? Now, there's two-part question to this. Is staying silent about somebody who's actually personally experiencing it, or has experienced it and not saying anything about it, or the danger of people saying, wow, that's really tough, sorry that's happening, and then moving on with their life.
Mm-hmm. Or saying like, please don't talk to me about that anymore.
Yeah, because you probably have heard that a lot.
Yeah, a lot. But I mean, then there's these wonderful people, like some of my donors are like, if you promise that I never have to go to Calcutta again, I will keep supporting you for the rest of my life. But so that's taking an action of a different kind. But certainly avoidance of pain and avoidance of wanting to look at these, horrific things. And that's why also I don't focus on them. I don't, talk about what happens, when it's obvious in a brothel, girls seeing 10, 20 men a night, like enough said, it, doesn't need to keep going into it, because that I think is more likely to make people so overwhelmed and so distressed that they back away. But, who was it that said, all that is necessary for evil to continue is for good people to do nothing or say nothing. And this is an issue that thrives in silence, in darkness, and in shame. We as a society have shame that this is happening in our country. India's got the same issue. And, the more we are ashamed about it and we keep it like in the shadows, other places, and don't talk about it, the more it can easily happen. But on the flip side of that, and the good news is, the more you expose it, shine a light on it, bring attention to it, intervene against it, it actually responds really well. It's an issue that can be handled, and in individual lives and in within communities, we've seen dramatic changes for the better. And there's, hundreds of thousands, hundreds and thousands of girls like Anjali who have come out of this place and are now living, a joyous, productive, wonderful life. Not all of them are opening charities, but some are, and others are becoming an accountant or an awesome mom or whatever it is that they dream of doing. And it's because someone stood in the way. Someone said, no, we can't have that. I'm going to not only speak out, but I'm going to do something to make sure that you have another opportunity. And there's just so many wonderful people working on this in every corner of the world, in the United States, in Asia and Africa, everywhere. So I say, join us. And if you can't join us, donate, spread the word, use your voice, whether it's, individually or in social media or whatever, to raise awareness. But the message I want people to share is not just that trafficking is horrible and unacceptable. Yes, that is true, but also that you can do something about it, and people are successfully, and it's actually an issue that responds really well to intervention.
Absolutely. And that's what was encouraging. I mentioned about the film that I watched. It was one of those ones that literally traumatized me that I just wanted to run the other direction. It was like,
what was it?
Doesn't matter. It was
Okay.
It was a while back, and I was just like, that was a lot, and I wasn't expecting it. Like you walked into that theater, and I wasn't expecting it, and it was like this presentation that I just went with a friend, and the thing is that what I love about what you're doing is that you're showing the solution. You're showing the other side of it. It's the light at the end of the tunnel, the hope, right? The possibility, so that you can see you're not negating the problem, but you're looking at the problem and saying, this is happening and we can do something about it. And this is what it looks like on the other side. And that's encouragement, right? There's a scripture in the Bible that says, where there is no vision, the people perish. And I think part of it is, so when we don't have vision for the possibility of creating healing and hope, then you don't start. You don't start because it's like, what's the point? So I just love that you're doing that. So just before we wrap up, I would love, you mentioned just briefly, you talked about Anjali, you mentioned briefly about a couple of other examples. Just tell us some stories of some of these girls that maybe have touched your heart the most, and maybe even kind of weaving in like what you personally have learned from this whole journey yourself.
Oh, there's so much in that, but I'll try to be brief. So one of the girls that has really touched my heart recently is this girl, Priya. And she is in our project, that's in the red light area. It's for kids that are growing up there, have been born into that community. And her mom was, trafficked, and her mother died when Priya was 12 of, the injuries that she sustained there. And so she's, was growing up in a pretty difficult, hopeless place, not having education. But then she started coming to the center, and she got education, and she got counseling and support. And she is a shining star. During COVID, without a computer, she used like a neighbor's smartphone to get help from tutors, to pass her high school exam, which is incredibly hard. And then she got selected to be able to interview Malala and Michelle Obama for International Day of the Girl. And when that opportunity came, it was so joyful for her. And she immediately said, how can we make this not just for me, but for all the kids in my, age group? And so she got together like 15 of the other kids from the red light area, and they all came up with the questions together. And I just loved that, even in that triumphant moment for herself, because she wants to be a photojournalist, so it was like a big opportunity. Even in that wonderful moment, she immediately thought, how can I share this with everybody else? It seems like people who have the least give the most and are willing to, give you what little they have. And that was such a beautiful example of that. What I've learned, I've learned so much, and I have been completely transformed through this journey of working with survivors. And biggest thing I think is just getting perspective. Every time I go to Calcutta, every time I go to Nepal, and I see and I work in these areas, shelters, red light areas, I come back and I just say, I'm never going to complain again. I am so lucky and so blessed. And my kids are blessed, and I never had to worry about how I'm going to feed my daughter and would I have to send her to work as a maid. Never. I can't even imagine what parents go through. So I always say I'll never complain again. And of course I do eventually complain again, but I keep it going for a good couple months. And I feel like it really has given me an incredible perspective, an incredible hopefulness that I never had before, that if you can rise up out of that, anything is possible, and we can transform our world through our love for one another into a heaven on earth. And I feel really very, very hopeful, and that's all thanks to these girls and women and what they've given me.
Well, it's a perfect example of blessed to be a blessing. It's like you receive and you give, and then you receive back this idea of generosity. And you mentioned sometimes it's the people that are the most in the most difficult situations that are actually the most giving and most generous. And it's so amazing. It's so amazing to see it. So I just appreciate what you're doing. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I encourage our listeners, go get a copy of both of her books. This is No Ordinary Joy. And the second one, which is the newest one, is Standing in the Way, co-authored with Anjali. And we'll make sure, of course, the links are in the show notes to get to those books. Also, there's a TED Talk that Sarah did called Living Heroically, and we'll make sure that's also there for you. Their website is herfuturecoalition.org. I would encourage you, if you want to get involved, Sarah already said it, get involved. If you don't want to go yourself, donate, do something. If this touches your heart, do something to get involved and participate. And it will not only will you be a blessing to it and to the girls that they are helping to move on from this, but it'll come back to you so many times over, blessing you with hope and confidence and knowing that you're doing something to make a difference. So we encourage you that. Any final words, Sarah, before we wrap up?
I just want to thank you, Nicole, for your open heart. This is a difficult issue, and for you to be willing to, look at it and to give voice to it publicly. It means a lot. Thank you so much.
Of course, my pleasure. My pleasure. Well, again, thank you for being here. Thank you to our listeners for being here. We appreciate you. We look forward to hearing your comments. If you have questions, reach out to us. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon.